Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this 2022 midterm election webinar. My name is Michael O'Keefe, Chief Investment Officer at Stifel. I want to kind of frame our session and get to our guest today in just a quick minute. As we sort of face towards the end of the year, we've had a lot of imbalance in the system, right? We've had elevated inflation that's caused the Fed to move towards a more hawkish policy that's led to higher rates and the risk of a recession. We're all watching things like equity earnings. The worries about all that have driven markets lower. We've had volatile markets along the way. We've seen geopolitical tensions ever present around the world, and then some imbalances in a way in DC. We always think about an election year, especially a midterm election year, as one that can be more volatile because of the uncertainty related to the midterms, people wondering what's going to unfold. And inevitably, a lot of times things calm down once you figure that out, once we know the results of the election and we can sort of understand where that might take us. So it's a way of stepping towards us finding balance, at least in DC. So the topic today is the 2022 midterm elections. And as is often the case, I'm really thrilled and honored to be joined by Brian Gardner, who's Stifel's Chief Washington Policy Strategist. Brian, welcome.
Good afternoon, Michael. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. And before we get started, there are probably a number of people viewing today that know about you, Brian, but if you could just take a quick second, give us a sort of an abbreviated explanation of your background, especially as it relates to your experience in DC, as sort of a first step to set the stage for today.
Sure. So I worked on Capitol Hill many moons ago, worked for a couple of members of what is now referred to as the House Financial Services Committee, working on economic and financial services issues. I also then worked for a law firm up in New York doing bank regulatory work. So you can kind of see my background in financial services. Joined KBW, which is a division of Stifel. Joined that firm in 2002 and became their policy analyst shortly thereafter. And KBW sold to Stifel in 2013. So I've been part of the Stifel family since then. And I guess right around my 2-year anniversary of moving over to the Stifel platform, just before the presidential election, moved over and assumed the new role. So I've been kind of, worked on the Hill and been following Washington for a while.
And as we've talked about over the last week or two, it's a very busy time for you with the election kind of coming at us. We're just 3 weeks away. And so I think everybody's wondering what in the heck is going to happen here. It leads really to the first topic. I just want to get directly into how you're seeing the election shape up, and obviously what's at play here is whether we'll have a divided government, control of one or both houses of Congress. So let's start there. How do you handicap the results? And while you do, I'll pull up some data that shows us what I think is what ultimately the polls are saying. So anyway, jump in, Brian.
Okay, thanks, Michael. So just a caveat before I go on. Obviously it is election season. People have very strongly views on politics, as do I. But my goal and intent is to call it down the middle and not cheerlead for one side or the other. So I hope you take that into account, that I'm not pulling for one side or the other. I'm just trying to give you a dispassionate view of how I see the election season unfolding and what that means for policy going forward. With that out of the way. Earlier in the year, we were at a point where it looked like a red wave. Very likely Republicans are going to win the House. The Senate map was never that friendly to Republicans, just because where the 35 seats are located and which party is defending more seats versus the other. Republicans are defending 21 of the 35, Democrats 14 of the 35. So in the Senate, Republicans have fewer pickup opportunities. It's just simple math. But early in the year, it looked like Republicans did have opportunities to win enough Senate seats to take control of the Senate. over the summer, that red wave started to peter out a little bit. Number of reasons. The Dobbs case from the Supreme Court on abortion energized Democrats. Gas prices, which had been rising all year, had flattened out and declined. The Democrats had a couple of legislative victories, which makes their own party feel good about themselves. It boosts their confidence, and that helps their election prospects. And then, the former President Trump was also in the news because of the Mar-a-Lago search, and that refocuses attention away from the incumbent back to the former president, and that all kind of comes together to hurt Republican prospects and help Democratic prospects. I started seeing that shift start to subside and shift back in the Republican direction, I guess very late August into Labor Day. Matter of fact, I tell people I was writing an election note the week before Labor Day, and I think I had to rewrite it and revise it several times because I was just picking up on tones and seeing some polling data that suggested there was a shift that was starting to take place back in the Republican direction, and that's where we are now. So I was looking at the Real Clear Politics average of the generic congressional poll. Which party are you going to vote for, Republican or Democrat? No candidates' names. Republicans have been up all year. Democrats, per that little summer bump, took the lead. They were up by a little bit more than a point. And as of this morning, it has reversed, and Republicans are back up in that poll by about just over 2 points. So we've had a 3.5 point swing towards Republicans in the last month. So in the House, I'm more confident than I was certainly 5-6 weeks ago. I've always believed Republicans would win, but I'm even more confident. And now I'm thinking, I've been in the 15 to 25 seat pickup range, probably at the higher end of that, seeing opportunities for Republicans to exceed that. So that's the House. And the Senate, I've kind of been narrowing the possible scenarios. I thought, the election could play out anywhere from Democrats gaining a seat. And for those of you who, don't remember 2018, these things do happen. 2018, Democrats, great year for them. They win 40 seats. They flip the House. They lost 2 Senate seats. So it can happen. It has happened. So anywhere from that 1 seat gain for Democrats to a 2-seat gain for Republicans. I'm narrowing it further. I don't think Democrats can pick up a seat at this point. I think maybe the better way to put it is it's a real long shot. It's technically possible, but a long shot. They can still control the Senate via a 50-50 split, which is quite reasonable. But Republicans' chances of gaining seats of 1, 2, I think 3 is a stretch, but I think those odds have certainly increased in the last month.
Staying on that, and focusing in really as we're approaching the election and watch things unfold, what are some of the key races you think of for the Senate? What should we be watching? And within that, are you looking for any sort of unexpected surprises?
So let me start with the seats that Democrats are defending. And I'm looking at 4 of them. They are Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and New Hampshire. Nevada is Republicans' best pickup opportunity. The Republican candidate there, Adam Laxalt, has been leading. It's a small lead, but it's a consistent lead. And you would think that the national mood bolsters his prospects. That looks like a pretty good opportunity for gains for Republicans. The Arizona and the Georgia seats, the Democratic incumbent, and they both won in special elections, interestingly enough, they both have small leads. They're consistent leads, but they're small. There are signs of warnings for both of them. They by no means have put those races away. In Georgia, the Republican candidate Herschel Walker has been involved in some controversy over the last couple of weeks. I won't go into it, but before and after polling suggests that scandal has not hurt his standing. And that's probably a warning sign to Democrats. Furthermore, in Georgia, there's a governor's race. The Republican candidate is likely to win anywhere from 5 to 10 points. And Governor Kemp could help drag Herschel Walker across the goal line. Arizona, a little bit different dynamic, but in 2020, Mark Kelly, the incumbent, underperformed his polling going into Election Day. If he does similarly this time, he's in trouble. So those are the seats I'm looking for. The New Hampshire seats is a bit of a stretch for Republicans. Democrats should hold on to that, but it's not a foregone conclusion. On the Republican side, look at Pennsylvania, Ohio, North Carolina, Wisconsin. Wisconsin, I think Republicans are starting to put that seat away. Again, not a foregone conclusion, but that looks like a really good hold opportunity for Republicans. North Carolina has been close the whole time. It looks like the Republican may be starting to open up a larger lead, so that looks pretty good. Ohio and Pennsylvania are the two more interesting races. Ohio, which is a pretty Republican state at this point. Republican J.D. Vance is running for his first time in office. The incumbent Rob Portman retiring, so an open seat. Vance has a very small lead. They debated last night. We'll see if that debate has any impact on the election. But again, this is similar to Georgia, where you have a popular Republican governor at the top of the ticket. Mike DeWine is running for re-election. He's probably going to win anywhere from 15 to 20 points. And so you would think that a gap like that over a Democratic challenger, it probably helps Vance eke that one out. Pennsylvania is clearly the best gain opportunity for Democrats. John Fetterman, the sitting lieutenant governor, facing Dr. Oz, Republican, first-time candidate. Fetterman has a small lead, but it's a consistent lead and kind of different from Georgia and Ohio. In that governor's race, you have a Democratic governor who's probably going to win fairly easily, and that's probably a headwind for Republicans and Dr. Oz. On the surprises, they're just a couple of things in different races that kind of catch your attention. I'll mention, two races that have been on the radar for folks, just Colorado and Washington, a view that if the tide really goes in the Republican direction, those seats are in play. So those are always been in the conversation, just on the periphery. And then on the Democratic side, a possible surprise is Connecticut, which is a reliably blue state. But the incumbent, Richard Blumenthal, seems to be struggling a little bit. There's some polling that came out over the weekend showing a surprisingly close race. Blumenthal up, but only mid-single digits, 5 points. So that could be a sign, again, of the movement nationally towards Republicans. And I guess if there's a surprise that goes away from Republicans that Democrats pick up, possibly Iowa. A poll came out over the weekend from the Des Moines Register and the Seltzer Group, which is a very highly regarded polling group. This is not some fly-by-night group. They do good work. They have a very strong track record showing that the incumbent Republican, Chuck Grassley, is only up by 3 in what is becoming a more reliably Republican state. Grassley's been there a long time. He's older. He's mentally competent and up to the job, but there may be a sense among Iowa voters, a desire for a fresh face. And so maybe there's an additional factor in there. So those are kind of the surprises that I'm looking at.
Just keeping an eye on. I'm going to pull this slide off here. I want to get to something that we wrestle with as investors, right? We take a step back and look at 2022, the volatility that we've experienced, and it's been sort of driven by essentially elevated and sustained elevated inflation, which is meant, as I said earlier, a shift in Fed policy, a jump in market interest rates. That means mortgage rates are up, gas is more expensive at the pump, food is more expensive. So we sort of talk a lot about these issues and how they affect the markets and investments, but also the consumer, which is a big driver of the economy. I'm curious from your perspective, as it relates to this potential shift in Congress, if there, obviously I would assume inflation, things like that, but are there themes like that that are really kind of on people's minds as they're heading to the polls from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, so Harvard did some polling, just came out with the Harris Group, and it kind of gets into this in depth, what's on voters' minds, not just the horse race aspect. How are voters prioritizing issues, and which party do they see as best equipped to address them? And this poll was a big alarm bell for Democrats, warning. So it is inflation and it's the economy, and they split them into two. And I would assume that jobs kind of fall into the second bucket, the economy bucket. But I mean, the two of them are so tightly intertwined, the economy and inflation. And it is by far and away the biggest issue. Republicans are favored, or the public in this poll shows more confidence in Republicans' ability to handle them. Next is crime, border. Also, Republicans favored to be able to handle them. Social issues that Democrats thought were helping them, abortion, and which did over the summer, it has faded as an issue. It's down at like number 5 or 6 in importance. So when you look at the national mood of what voters are prioritizing, and which party they think is best equipped to address those issues, it's really lining up for Republicans at a really key part of the election cycle when voters are totally engaged. This is not June, July, August, when summer distractions and the election is so far away that people aren't as engaged. Voters are now engaged thoroughly, and early voting has started in many states. So more than just engaged, they've actually voted.
Yeah, I in fact sent mine in last week, so indeed it is kicked off. So let's look forward a little bit. And you and I have talked a little bit about the concept of lame duck session, what's coming up here. Maybe you could talk about some scenarios that will unfold. Obviously, in particular, if we end up with a divided Congress, number one, what will drive activity in terms of outcomes, and then number two, what specific kinds of things might we see legislatively or otherwise in a lame duck session? So,
yeah, when Congress returns, it will have several must-do pieces of legislation that they have to finish by year end, and in some cases sooner. One is what we will refer to as the Omnibus spending bill, which covers appropriations for all sectors of the federal government, other than entitlements, which are on autopilot. There's a temporary spending bill in place into mid-December that either has to be extended on a temporary basis, or the Omnibus, which would be for the rest of the fiscal year through next September. The National Defense Authorization Act, which is an annual defense policy bill. Those are both must do. Then there are a couple of really important, Congress would really like to get these done. It's not critical because there are no specific deadlines, but something called the Tax Extenders Bill, which is a package of tax laws that expire on an annual basis, and Congress regularly extends them for 1 year. And I'm sure a lot of viewers are asking, what the heck? What's that all about? And it's pure budget gimmickry, right? You don't have to account for it in a long-term budget process forecast, because technically it expires in a year. So you don't have to budget it for years 2 through 10. By law, it doesn't exist 2 through 10. So that becomes an attraction for other tax proposals. So the omnibus, the spending bill, that could be a vehicle to revisit the energy permitting issue, which was up during the temporary bill back in September. That's part of the deal between Senators Manchin and Schumer to streamline the energy permitting process. It got blocked. There is going to be an effort to bring it back. It's far from a slam dunk, but Republicans who were not anxious to give the Democrats a win, especially Manchin, because of the way it was handled during the summer months, they are now open to some form of energy permitting reform post-election. So we'll see what happens there. The NDAA, a number of issues could be added on there. And it includes the Safe Banking Act, which would allow the banking industry to service the cannabis industry in states where the substance is legal. It's gotten really close in the past. Chances are probably better than they ever have been for SAFE. And something called the Durbin Bill, which is a payments bill related to MasterCard and Visa and the big banks on credit card purchases. Senator Durbin wants to add it to the NDAA. He got blocked at the committee level. He's got to bring it back. It's an outside shot, but something certainly for the financial sector, something that bears watching. And then aside from the usual list of tax extenders, and a lot of them are energy credits, you have R&D expensing, which went under the Trump tax cut of 2017. This year it converted into a 5-year deduction. So there have been negotiations to retroactively suspend that, keep it as 1-year expensing, maybe a further delay of it. And then the business interest deduction, also part of the Trump tax cut, that tax law capped the ability of businesses to deduct their interest expenses to 30% of EBITDA. Starting January 1, it gets further narrowed to 30% of EBIT. So there have been talks about, delaying that implementation another year, 2 years. Scrapping it probably is a bridge too far, but so if the Senate flips, then the political calculus flips. First, you're going to have a host of lawmakers who are not coming back. And boy, do they want to get out of town. They just want to pack up their offices and go home. So you have that dynamic, and how that impacts legislation is unpredictable, but there's going to be a lot of pressure on lawmakers just to cut deals and go. They don't want to be in Washington anymore. The other is that if Democrats have lost the Senate, then they have lost the ability to confirm judges nominated by the president. And so in his last month, 6 weeks as majority leader, I can see Majority Leader Schumer scheduling as many votes on judicial nominations. Those take time. It's not just, we're going to have a vote. There's a debate and vote, and it just sucks up time. And so does that crowd out a series of these items, especially in the tax extenders bill, because that's not a must do? Does that squeeze out the tax extenders bill and punt it to 23? It's certainly possible. I think there are a number of Republicans, especially Republican leaders, that would like to address it now, clear the decks, and start with a fresh slate in 23 and not have to revisit these old issues and just political messaging. We're the new guys in town, fresh start, here's our agenda, let's go. They don't want to be dealing with old agenda items. Yep. So there are a series of conflicting interests, but the Senate flipping would make handicapping the outcome of a lame duck a lot more challenging. Let's put it that way.
Now, before we move to changing control and what will happen in the next session in 23, sort of a point specific question. Let's say Democrats actually end up keeping the House. There's been a lot of speculation as to whether Speaker Nancy Pelosi, tries to. I guess it would be an election to re-elect her as Speaker, but where do you think she lands on that if in fact the House stays Democratic?
It's such a good question, and no one really knows. She has not indicated. Now, if she wants to stay as Speaker, it would be very difficult for Democrats to push her aside if she just led them to a momentous win that totally contradicted expectations, went against history. And she's a phenomenal fundraiser for the party. I mean, regardless of what you think of her politics, she's a phenomenal fundraiser, and she's very adept at managing her caucus and keeping everybody kind of on the same page, and which is not easy. So that would be tough to push her if she doesn't want to. At the same time, all three House Democratic leaders, the Speaker, the Majority Leader, and the Whip, are all in their 80s. And there is a new generation of rank and file Democrats who are waiting for their time in power. Now, Pelosi has a way of talking about power, and I'm going to paraphrase. I may screw it up a little bit, but power is not given; it's taken. And so they may have to take it from her. It's not just going to be given to this new generation. But let's just, for a second, just, say, okay, Democrats do keep the House and they do replace Pelosi. That raises a new series of questions and challenges for Democrats, because this new generation would be new to the game. And what are their leadership abilities? Are they as good at raising money as Pelosi has been? And are they as good as managing the House Democratic caucus? All unknowns. It would raise questions for the tech industry, because I think Pelosi has been a defender of, a native industry from California. And so for a non-Californian coming into the Speaker's office, I think tech would lose a pretty valuable, powerful ally in the Speaker's office.
Okay, helpful, we don't know. Let's go back to the scenario where the House flips. For the next 2 years, until the next election, which we'll get to in a moment, what will happen? What can get done? What might get done?
Yeah, not a lot. It's kind of like the lame duck session in a way. It's must pass. Items that are deemed to be luxury or controversial, they're going to have a tough time passing. The more controversial an issue is, the tougher time it will be for leaders of both sides to come to a compromise and pass something and get it to the president's desk. The more inconsequential items can, because they don't move voters, they don't motivate voters, and therefore there's no implications for Washington. So budget bills, but those are going to be heavily fought over. Conservative Republicans are going to want less spending, and they are going to fight with the administration, and there is a rising prospect of government shutdowns at some point. Now, from a market perspective, there tends to be sell-offs going into a shutdown. It can last through the shutdown. Once the shutdown is resolved and government reopens, the markets correct themselves. So it's a trading issue, not an investment issue. And then you have the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling, which will need to be raised sometime, probably in the middle to second half of the year. It had looked like it might be a first half event. It's all about cash flows. It is not a date certain. But anyway, at some point it has to be raised. And conservative Republicans think that this is leverage for them to extract policy concessions from from a Democratic administration. And so I think I think that chances are high of having something like 2011 all over again, where you had a House Republican Speaker and a Democratic president facing down each other until they got to an agreement, but a lot of turmoil in the markets, a lot of volatility. So, but on the broader agenda, kind of on nuts and bolts, when I think about energy policy or financial services policy, banking regulation, it's going to be very, very difficult for the two. I mentioned tech before. There is bipartisan interest in doing an antitrust bill that targets social media. I just don't know that the parties know how to get to an agreement on it. And I think a split Congress just makes that argument even tougher. And we'll be going into the 24 election, so there'll be only a narrow window in which the parties can possibly cooperate. That window will close very quickly.
I think that, I've heard the term gridlock. If we end up with a divided government, which probably means not a lot of fiscal spending, which at least for inflation maybe is a step in a better direction.
No, definitely. But longer term, there's also the question of the expiring Trump tax cuts. They expire after 25. So this is not an imminent issue, right? They are in place for several years. But that certainly is an issue that's going to start to percolate up a little bit.
Yep. Hey, I want to get to the 24 election, but before we go there, Brian, we saw, for example, the president kind of impose some additional constraints on China as it relates to semiconductors. There's some moves being made that are more foreign policy driven. I guess when you think about the landscape in your seat as our sort of key guy in DC, what are you focused on as it relates to foreign policy?
Well, there's a lot to focus on. Every presidential candidate runs on domestic policy, but as soon as they get in office, they realize that foreign policy might dominate their administrations. So it's the old Mike Tyson line: everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And that's what foreign policy is. It's a punch in the mouth to every administration and their agenda. You have the China-Taiwan scenario, which, I think one of our better calls coming out of the 2020 election, was that the tariffs would stay in place at least for a while. That has continued to be, I think we've been right on that, because there is bipartisan consensus. Actually, I would call it bipartisan competition for who can be tougher on China. And so that puts the administration in a very tough spot. They don't want to be seen as soft on China, not to mention that labor loves the tariffs on Chinese goods. So there's a lot of internal democratic pressure to keep tariffs in place. But and then you have the obvious foreign policy implications. If the House flips, the Russia-Ukraine situation gets interesting, especially if there's a recession, which seems more likely than it used to for 23. There's been bipartisan agreement on funding for Ukraine. I'm going to be following very closely to see how that changes. There are Republicans who are skeptical. They're isolationists, and so it's more America first, take care of us at home first before spending abroad. And that's been a minority, but it's been a vocal minority. And if we go into recession, how does the political calculus change? I think you're going to see a growing group of Republicans more Ukraine skeptic. And so how that impacts the Western alliance at a time when you have a new right-of-center Italian government, a right-of-center Swedish government, which just took over within this past week, a lot of chaos in the UK, very unstable political situation in the United Kingdom. the dynamic between the U.S. and Europe, as Europe is evolving, as the U.S. is evolving. If you add into a recession into that, a lot of questions, not a lot of answers about how U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Ukraine evolves.
Yeah, that's such a tough topic. All right, I have one last question before we talk about the longer term future. White House 2024, who are the two candidates?
All right, so with all the caveats and disclaimers that we're over 2 years away from Election Day 24, I think there's a really good chance we're heading for a replay. Yeah. So I'll start on the Republican side, because I think that leads to my answer on the Democratic side. So on the Republican side, I have becoming more convinced that President Trump wants to run again. It's not a foregone conclusion. This is not 100%, but it's certainly above 50-50. I kind of been in the 60-40 range that he would run. I think my odds are probably closer to 2-1 that he's going to run. Why? He thinks that that the last election was stolen. His voting base clearly thinks that, and that they were robbed either through the ballot process of 2020, through the Russia collusion allegations during his administration, the impeachment try that Democrats had after they retook the House, that he was robbed of his administration and he wants another chance at it. And so he's all in. And, that begs the question, can he win the nomination? And my answer is yes. 2016 should have taught all of us who were skeptical, and I'll include myself, should have taught us a lesson about underestimating him. Secondly, this is kind of connected to that, but Republican Party rules in most states are winner take all or winner take most. The bulk of delegates go to the winner in a primary or caucus. And Trump didn't put up huge numbers in winning in 2016, but there were enough. And it's the old Trump line, his base will stay with him even if he walked down Fifth Avenue and shot people. So he can keep 30 to 35% of the Republican electorate. And if the rest of the field is fractured, no one is going to get above that number. And so I can see a scenario where you turn around in May 24 and he has sewn up the nomination. So that's the Republican side. And then why do I say a repeat? Because in my view, President Biden views himself as the only Democrat who can beat Donald Trump. That was a motivation for him in 2020. I think it continues to be a motivation for him. There is growing pressure within the party for him to step aside. So I think that I would put the odds of Biden running for re-election at lower than I had for Trump. But I still think they're above 50-50. And no Democrat could come in and knock off a sitting president in a primary. They can mortally damage him and make him unelectable in the general election, but they could not. The chances of knocking him off in the primary are close to zero.
Got it. Well, I want to sort of end on something that isn't so much a question, Brian, as a statement. And I've talked a lot about this over the last few years. When we look at the current situation, I relate it back to the economy and the markets. We run pretty big deficits. We have a lot of debt. We've had this historic sort of fiscal and monetary support in the wake of the pandemic. I like to think of it as there's some work to do with the way our government's run to kind of rein in the debt in particular. And so I'll leave you with this statement that says, look, we'll get through this election. I think that's probably a chunky topic for us to speak about and engage about, and maybe at a future webinar. And maybe just in closing, to bring it back to my comments at the beginning, we sit here today, my group at Stifel, looking forward to the next 3 to 6 to 12 months. And we believe we're going to start to see some resolution on a lot of things that have been troubling us, right? One is the uncertainty of the midterm. So we know that'll get resolved in 3 weeks, basically. But we also think when we look at the drivers of inflation, supply chain pressures, and then the demand side of things with the Fed's action, we think inflation will subside. We think that will give the Fed room to back off a little bit, and that will calm things down. So we do expect volatility to ease up a little bit. We have some issues still out there for sure around the world in terms of geopolitical tensions, but we like to think of it as in the next 3 to 6, 9 to 12 months, basically finding a little more balance than we've had so far this year. So Brian, I'll end it there. Let me turn to you and thank you very much for spending time today with us and our clients. Any parting comments?
No, I mean, just adding on to what you said, I describe myself as kind of a short-term pessimist, long-term optimist. Don't bet against the American economy or the American political system over time. We have our struggles every couple of decades, but it's kind of in the American DNA to figure a way out. So even though it's not always obvious, it does work itself out. So I think the advice and the counsel that you give to our clients lines up perfectly with that view. And I think it's important to take that long-term view and perspective.
Yeah, very good. Brian, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you, Michael.